yourselves. One of the maybe rare commodities or rare experiences today is appreciating the dignity and the majesty of every human journey. The more industrialized and commercialized the world gets, the more things are measured by externals like money, where people, many people would define their self-worth by their net worth. And though anyone understands logically, and when you give it some thought, that to measure your value based on superficial values, like whether it's money or looks or any other temporary thing that doesn't last, is really tying your future and your destiny in things that are temporary, which of course means that your value is also temporary, and which therefore behooves us to understand that if you want to really appreciate your own value, and everybody who gives it some thought does want to do that, you recognize that your value is far more than anything that just lasts for a short time. That's why the great blessing of building a family, children, leaving a legacy, something especially that the Jews mastered more than any other nation in history, where today we don't even know who the grandchildren of the great Romans are, or the great Egyptian empire, or the Babylonian, or the Persian, or the Syrian, the Spanish, and so on. And here we are able to speak about our ancestors like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. We know where they're buried, we know where they walked, we know how they lived their lives, because we always attribute a true value to things that are not measurable. So there may have been a time in the life where, in the world, in history, where, as they put it, size mattered. In a certain way, you can say that the modern advancements of technology and science, if they taught us anything, is that the most powerful forces in life are invisible. The things that shape and define us, both on a biological level, take DNA, or our cellular structure, take subatomic particles, quantum mechanics, more microscopic forces that no human eye can see, and actually there's not even instruments that can really directly observe much of this phenomenon that we know today, shape all of reality. In that context, we begin to appreciate that the forces that define existence are not things that you can measure and not things that you can value. So in that context, and I'll get back to that in a moment, for me it's always been the biggest honor and the greatest blessing to intersect with other people's, as I said, spiritual journeys, because that's where things really count. The long-term, the eternal and immortal value that we have, which is not bound to the, as I said, the superficial and the temporary, that's so much, that we worship so much, and that is so much part of our daily routines. So if you were to list literally what you did today or any given day, you'll find that most of our activities are involved with temporary conquests, things that don't last. And this has become the dominant feature in our lives. And and especially when you think of it in terms of entertainment, in the media, people who can't, for example, miss a certain segment of the soap opera or whatever other show they're watching, or the football games, or others. And this is not to dismiss any of its certain value that it has, but when you tie your destiny, you tie your lot and your success in things that are not even real, you could imagine why we suddenly feel so insignificant in a big world like this, because we're worshiping, and we're worshiping idols that don't have any permanent value. So in that sense, from the Jewish perspective, and I like to look at it as a universal perspective, the Jews introduced to the world the concept of eternal values, things that are not, you may not be able to measure it immediately, and it does not pass the test of instant gratification, but on the other hand, it creates something that's lasting forever and ever. And if you think of all the most important words in our lives, love, truth, soul, God, values, family, children, every one of them is associated with things that do not die. Bodies may die, but love does not die. And the people that we cherished, and we, in our lifetimes, even when they're gone, we remember them forever. Because it's not just, obviously we miss them and we'd love to be able to connect with them on a physical level, but anyone who knows, anyone who's suffered a loss of a parent or another loved one, and had a loving relationship, knows that doesn't die. It doesn't die. Because the connection the two human beings have on a soul level is not bound by the laws of nature as we understand them. And they tap into, as I said, those invisible eternal forces that define existence. So in that context, it's a good segue to address the topic, the title, the somewhat cryptic title that we call this class, and that is an unknown word that carries the secret to everything. I'm going to introduce a word this evening that maybe some of you may have heard from me, but it's not a word that you find common in common lexicon of the people. And the truth is, it's not just a word, it's actually a letter. Now, just by a matter of introduction, the Hebrew alphabet is a very fascinating alphabet, and it's been studied by many people, scholars and mystics and poets alike, because, as you may know, many languages, in the study of linguistics, languages, there are generally two types of languages. There are languages that are called descriptive languages. Most languages, all languages in the Latin family are descriptive languages. That includes English, French, German, Spanish. Descriptive means that the words essentially they describe either phenomena or objects or experiences. So we use the word, I'm sitting in a chair, is a descriptive statement. But there's another set of languages which are far fewer, and they're called the metaphorical languages. The words there are metaphorical. Hebrew is one of them. What do I mean by metaphorical? Every word has layers and layers of meaning. So, for example, if you know these languages, Hebrew, one sentence in Hebrew usually requires at least a paragraph in English and 2 paragraphs in French, because a descriptive language uses many more words. Chinese is also, by the way, a metaphorical language, but very different. Not that I know Chinese, but from my studies, which is why I know the Chinese typewriter has, I think, 3,000 keys. Yeah, it's a very, very large typewriter, and it's not practical, actually, because letters are metaphorical. You know, the English language, for example, letters you can combine in many different ways. Hebrew as well. Hebrew is like almost a bridge between metaphorical and descriptive, as I'll explain. So, in that context, every Hebrew word has meaning. When you say, for example, the word chair, even though it may have some Latin Greek root, but for all practical purposes, a chair could have been called a table, and a table could have been called a chair. This is just what we call in Hebrew shemus eskamim. We agreed, the community, the culture, the society agreed, we'll call this thing cheese, and this we'll call meat. This we'll call a chair, this we'll call a table. They said they have some etymological roots that, interesting, by the way, can be traced to Hebrew as well. For example, Aleph, Beis are the first 2 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, so it's very obvious. A, B, A, Alpha, B, Bet, Beta, and so on. So it is rooted in the Hebrew language, but once it assumed its own language, most of the Western languages, it became very descriptive. In Hebrew is metaphorical, meaning that a word has many, many layers, and not only layers of meaning, but every Hebrew letter, for instance, of the 22 Hebrew letters of the Hebrew alphabet, have also a meaning. The letter itself has a meaning, and it's significant. Like for most of us, when we say the word, let's say, chair, we don't really care whether C has a meaning and H has a meaning or not. All we care about is the combination of the letters. They spell the word chair. In Hebrew, every letter, kisei, which is the Hebrew word for chair, the chaf is significant and is part of understanding what a chair is like, the samach and the aleph. The same thing with every Hebrew word or Hebrew name, which is why Hebrew names have such significance. Let's say when you get an aliyah, or when you ask a refuah shlema, a prayer for healing, we always look for the Hebrew name and the mother's name, because the names are considered, as the mystics put it, the channels that channel the soul's energy into your system. Think of it like this way. The soul on its own is a projector of white light, and the name, the letters, think of them like a film that shape that and channel the white light into a particular shape. And then suddenly you see not just a white light, you see them shaped, and that shape is also very significant. In addition to that, every Hebrew letter also has a gematria. Gematria means a numerical equivalent. So Aleph is 1, Beis is 2, Yud is 10. It goes from 1 through 10, then from 10 till 100, and then from 100 till 400. So, and then there's the combinations of the letters. I'm not going to go through the whole discussion. It really is books, volumes are required. The transmutations and permutations of the letters and how they're combined and how they can be reversed and the many meanings in this particular word. The reason I give this introduction is because it's part of the secret word that I'm going to, and secret letter that I'm going to discuss this evening. And the reason I'm discussing it is also part of today is a special day in the culture where I grew up, and I think when it's explained, it's really a special day for any culture, and that is the 66th anniversary of the passing of the previous Chabad Rebbe, my mentor's father-in-law, and the assumption of leadership by my teacher and Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who I wrote the book Toward a Meaningful Life, and I had the privilege to work for him for many years. The job that I've mentioned a number of times of memorizing on Shabbat and holidays, when no tape recorders were used and no notes were taken, we had to retain hours and hours of these talks. I was one of the select few that was able to do that, and that was my claim to fame, let's put it that way. And it's a whole other discussion, which I shall discuss briefly later. It's also part of this whole, this word that I'm going to address, in how do you actually remember so many hours. And as you'll see, there are methods that every one of us can master if you master the word that we're going to discuss here. So yeah, I know it's good. I'm building the suspense up, and I will not wait till the end of the class I will discuss it. It's not, I'm not doing it for dramatic purposes. It is because the word and the letter are very significant, and as I said before, the most powerful things that today we know, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, even 300 years ago, 200 years ago, we did not value the invisible as much as today. That's why there was a lot of superstition about forces. Today science has taught us much, but science has also taught us that the real forces at work are not visible. The question is why? Why can't we see subatomic particles? And we know today that it's not just a matter that we have to build greater instruments. If you're familiar with some quantum mechanics, you know that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle established as counterintuitive and as ridiculous as it may, bizarre as it may sound, established that there's certain data, there's certain information that's not just we're lacking information. It's fundamentally impossible to know, for example, with the velocity and the position of a subatomic particle until you measure it. It's impossible to know the two. And this was a big radical revelation because there was a philosopher, a scientist, Laplace, a French thinker, who in the late 19th century came out with a statement which disturbed the church greatly. The statement was that being that science is now replacing religion, science is supplanting all the different reasons we needed religion and faith and all that. So he made a statement that provide me with the data on any given person or any given situation, and I can predict how that person will behave till the end of time. In other words, essentially, the only reason we can't make predictions is because we don't have all the information. But if we were able to know and map out the genome or the DNA structures of each of us, you could predict everything you're ever going to do to the end of time. Now, of course, the religious thinkers at the time were very disturbed by this, because if that's the case, it takes away the whole concept of free will, because it means everything is wired. Just like you can predict that a leopard or a lion will go hunting for prey, it's a given. It's not a matter of prophecy. You know that because that's nature. And just like you can predict that the sun is going to rise, when I say predict, meaning you can know exactly what time the sun will rise in 1,000 years from now, because these are mathematical and scientific equations. So the same thing, give me all the data on something. The only reason we can't make predictions is because we don't have all the information. If we have all the information, it became something that everyone agreed, because it made sense. So the question was, now can we actually gather all the data? But then, in the early 20th century, new discoveries, first Einstein's relativity and special relativity theory, but then afterwards, especially the world of quantum mechanics and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle among them, established something that was very disturbing to scientists. So the church were disturbed by Laplace, and now they were disturbed by new findings that were actually rejected for decades. Einstein till his last day, rejected certain principles of quantum mechanics. He called it spooky, called it bizarre, crazy, and so on. His statement was God doesn't play dice with the universe, to which Niels Bohr, his colleague, said, don't tell God what to do. That was the discussions. Because inherent component in science was predictability, or another word for determinism. Take the billiard ball effect, which is just the basis of Newtonian physics, which is, if you hit a billiard ball exactly the same way, in the same direction, the same angle, it will always have action, will always cause this reaction. That's the fundamental predictability of nature. If obviously there's a shift and there's some change, it will have different results. But if you do this, that's what nature is. You throw up a stone, it will always fall down. And you throw it up at a certain speed, it will always fall down at a certain speed. That's what mathematical and scientific equations are all about. Suddenly they were discovering that there are things that are not that way, what they called indeterministic states, or or states of probability, where you can't say something is, let's say, whether a light is a wave or a particle. You cannot determine that until somebody measures it and defines it. But up till that point, it was discovered, and as I said, scientists especially rejected, because this was a radical shift that undermined the basis of scientific logic, that things are predictable. And here suddenly there's a whole reality that is indeterministic. You may have heard of Schrodinger's cat and other different mental exercises that the physicists developed. And I don't want to go into the details of it, it's not so relevant. Just the point that I want to say is, till Laplace's theory fell apart. It's not just a matter of you don't have the data. Even if you had all the data, there are areas that are unpredictable because they're fundamentally not defined. And if it's not defined, you can't predict what's going to happen, whether it will go in this direction or that direction. So, with that said, today we live in a world with all the commercialization and then the superficiality that I've mentioned before, but there's another side. We've discovered that the invisible controls reality. Look, what is one of the most devastating, I don't even want to mention it, but I'll mention it simply to make the point. One of the most devastating diseases, cancer. It wasn't a disease 100 years ago. Many say because by the time you got of age where cancer could come, other stuff killed you. So it wasn't exposed yet. But cancer, no one really understands. Cancer is an attack on the cellular structure of a human being. It's very different than a heart disease or other things which are definable. Cancer, the only way to fight it is that you have to kill healthy cells with unhealthy cells, because it becomes something that's part of your organism. Or any essentially autoimmune diseases. These are diseases that are much more prevalent today, and there's arguments, some say, due to the toxins and the pollutants of modern technology. Others say that simply we didn't recognize it before and was not diagnosed properly because it was hard to diagnose diseases of this nature. And others say, as I mentioned, that other things killed people. If your life expectancy was 47 years old, or whatever it was in 1920, obviously by the time a person was 47, other things killed them, so cancer never came around, so to speak. So it's a part of the so-called byproduct of longevity. Anyway, I'm in a room with a doctor, so I don't want to talk too much, but also I'll say something. By no means I'm a medical expert. I'm just mentioning some general things, and I hope I got it right. But the point, however, is definitely right, and that is that invisible and the microscopic level, what do they call nanotechnology? Even talking about medicine, look what's the miracles of surgery today, capable on a really nano level, again showing us the ability to reach places that once upon a time were essentially invisible to us or impossible due to its micro nature. Things were seen in very, things that tangible, measurable, and so on. So what do we learn from all this is that that the real forces of life, and if you want to really appreciate what defines life and what makes us healthy human beings, we have to appreciate those invisible forces. And as long as you worship or in some way are seduced and controlled by the visible ones, then you're missing the bottom line, which is the forces, the real foundation of life. And that connects all back to what I'm saying, that the Hebrew alphabet as well as the theme of the word that I was describing. So being that it's the 66th year from 1950 was when that Rabbi Yitzchak passed away. His son-in-law assumed leadership. So there's a classic discourse, a Hasidic discourse, a dissertation essentially, that was delivered, that was published 66 years ago on the 10th of Shvat, this day, and which was a Shabbos that year. And it was a discourse of 20 chapters. And when his son-in-law, the 7th Chabad Rebbe, as I said, my direct teacher, mentor, began his leadership, this became the so-called the operative discourse that would be delivered every year as on this anniversary. And every year the Rebbe would discuss another one of the 20 chapters in a cycle of every 20 years, finishing and then beginning again. So we are now in the 4th cycle, chapter 6. So chapter 6 is like all the chapters have their different themes, is the theme of this word that I want to introduce here. And the letter. The word is bittul, and the letter is yud. The letter yud. So let's start with the letter yud, and then I'll explain. The letter, as I said, the Hebrew alphabet consists of 22 letters. And the 10th letter is the yud. So you may have heard of a yud. Yud is the smallest letter. It's really a dot. When you make it on paper, when you draw it, it's a dot, like a little dot, a little more than a dot and a drop, a little like think of it like a short, what's equivalent in English, like an apostrophe, essentially. So it's the smallest letter you can possibly make. I'm thinking the English alphabet, what's the smallest letter? There is really no. Every letter is full blown. But in the Hebrew alphabet, you have letters, and their shapes are also very fascinating. They're like structure. Like, for example, bays, just to show you how it's metaphorical in that sense. A bays is the second letter. Now, bays, what does a bays mean? Bayit. In Hebrew, the letter B comes from beta, bet, and Hebrew bet is a bayit, is a house. If you look at the shape of the Hebrew letter beit, it looks like a house. What is a house? It's 3 lines with one opening. If you make a simple image of a house, you usually do here it's structured, it's on its side, because you have a door, and then you have 3 walls. That's what a base looks like. So each letter actually captures of the theme of the word, of the letter, and all the words that will be created, be shaped by that letter. So what does the letter Yud symbolize? That's what he discusses in this chapter 6. So the letter Yud, first of all, as you look at it, you see it's the minimalistic, the smallest shape you can possibly make. You can't be smaller than Yud. In mathematical equivalent, it's a dot. Now, everyone knows Mathematics 101. The first thing you study when you study geometry in high school, the first page literally of every geometry book is, what is a dot? What is a point? And what is a line? A line is the shortest route from one place to another. And a point is infinite points in a line, because a point doesn't occupy space. But as soon as you ask the teacher, what do you mean? When we make points, you make dots, there's only that many dots that can fit into a line. So we learn the abstract idea that the dot really does not occupy space. The only thing is we physical human beings need to make a dot for us to be able to see it. But in effect, there's infinite dots in a line. No matter how big the line is, whether it's a 1-inch line, whether it's a 1,000,000-mile line, there's infinite dots in the line, infinite dots. And you begin to learn the concept of a point, a line, and then a plane, which turns it into a square or a rectangle, triangle, and so on and so forth. That's all still 2-dimensional. And then, of course, there's the 3rd dimension in cubic geometry. But let's go back to the point. The point is the Yud. So it's really, is it really occupy space, or does not occupy space? So in the mathematical concept, we learn the concept of things that do not occupy space. Because if there's infinite points in a line, and the line is measurable, you have to say that a point does not occupy space. Now, that's on a mathematical level. What does it mean on a psychological, spiritual, personal level? So the Yud symbolizes this theme that I mentioned, the word bittul. B-I-T-T-U-L. It's a Hebrew word that is very difficult to translate in the English language. And one assumption for that, one of the reasons for that is probably because the English language doesn't tolerate the concept. So the loose translation of bittul is the following, is a combination of modesty, humility. The best way I often translate it is suspending yourself in order to achieve something greater than yourself. And in it lies the secret to every aspect of growth, of relationships, of intimacy, of connecting to eternal things. Now we'll start on a very basic intellectual level. What is the key to intellectual growth, to cognitive, to your mind growing, is the receptivity that you have that you don't know everything. If you think you know it all, there's no way you can grow intellectually. That's why you'll see people who are arrogant, or they think they have it all figured out. These are people who are the most closed-minded. And you can be very academic, you can be brilliant, and also be closed-minded, because you're convinced you know it all. The first step in any type of intellectual inquiry, free inquiry, is recognizing you don't know it all. They say there's a custom in the Far Eastern disciplines that when you come see your master for the first time, your teacher, the custom is you bring him a cup of water. So the student brings a cup of water. Everyone thinks that the reason is, like, in a way, showing respect to him. Bring him a cup, like serving him. And the master, what he does is, you give him the cup of water, he takes it. Instead of drinking it, he pours it out and gives you back the cup upside down and says to you, when you're empty like this cup, then you come back to me. Because a filled cup cannot be filled. If you think you already have it all figured out, you're not going to be receptive to hearing anything. So there's an expression in this chapter 6, Klei Reikon, an empty container, receives and is able to absorb. Think of a saturated sponge versus a dry sponge. Which one is going to absorb? The more saturated you are, the more full you are with your own way of looking at things, the less capable you are of hearing something new. Now, it's interesting, children, because they don't yet have developed tools and perspectives and mechanisms and frameworks, that's why they receive so well. That's why it's so easy to teach children a new language, ABC. Try learning ABC at age 20, 30, 40, 50. Who would have patience to sit in a classroom and write 1,000 times A? You know, you want to conquer the world, you want to make money, you have things to do, you're not busy sitting. But children don't yet have those vistas and horizons to conquer. They don't know anything yet, so they're empty. Their dry sponge, which is their fertile mind, a clean slate, allows them to absorb new ideas. At what point do we become so saturated we can't hear new ideas? Some people say at age 8, 9, you've already developed all your methodologies and mostly unhealthy habits. But the key to any type of growth requires some type of vacuum or emptiness. Because if you don't have that, then a filled cup cannot be filled. And across the board, let's look at it this way. You have to shed one layer of skin to assume another layer of skin. You have to melt a piece of gold or another precious metal to shape it into an ornament. We all go through the awkwardness of adolescence. A child is born only after birth pains. There's nothing in life that is worth talking about that is not preceded by some form of bittul, or the yud, some form of an emptiness that allows you to enter into a new state. And because as long as you're just extending your old state, then you're not growing. You're just an extension of the old. There's a good story, a good metaphor for this, the story of the Chelem story, which I mentioned a number of times. So the people of Chelem were these fools, they said, in the city in Poland. And you have this folklore and all these parables. So there was this farmer in Chelem. Chelem was a small town, and of course the farm was even smaller. But he was very proud of his farm because it was his baby. It was his inheritance from his parents, generations. So he knew every grain of soil in this little farm. One day he gets a visitor, a cousin, a distant cousin, from a large American farm, let's say Texas or Iowa, wherever the big farms are. And he's coming here to Chelem. You can imagine the guy's farm was bigger than Chelem and maybe bigger than all of Poland maybe. Anyway, so he shows him around, he gives him the royal tour. They sit down to dinner. The Chelem farmer says to his cousin, tell me, what do you think about my farm? He says, it's nice and cute, but it's so tiny. The Chelem farmer is taken aback. He's like insulted. He says, well, how big is your farm in Iowa? So how is an Iowa farmer going to explain to a small shtetl provincial guy, a farmer from Poland and Chelem, the size of a farm that's thousands of acres? What's he going to tell him? He won't believe him if he tells. So he used a point of reference. He said, my farm, how large it is, it takes me all day to travel with my tractor from one end of the farm to the next. So suddenly the Chelem farmer has a feeling of empathy and compassion for his cousin and says to him, don't feel bad, cousin. I once had a tractor like that too. Now, if we were to give out a survey and ask you, are you open-minded, closed-minded? Are you objective or subjective? Are you narrow-minded? Very few people are going to mark the box, I'm narrow-minded, closed-minded, and subjective, because part of subjectivity makes you think you're objective. That's part of the problem. This Kelem farmer was not malicious. He just didn't fathom. How could he imagine a farm? So when he hears it took all day, the only reference he has is his own old shmata jalopy that he had that took all day to crank up, to move from here to here. What else? We all have our farms. And our farms, and so when someone says to you, are you an objective person? The true answer has to be, I'm as objective as my perspectives allow me. How could you be objective? You don't even know. If you don't know what you don't know, how could you claim that you're objective? So let's say someone's standing on the ground, and someone said, what does the horizon look like? So you give a picture of the sky, the sundown, the sunset, etc. Someone climbs on a mountain, let's say 100 feet up. What does the horizon look like? It's a very different description. You climb to the top of the mountain, it's a whole different description. And you could be the same person. And the answer is they all told you the truth. However, they should just qualify and say, based on standing on the ground, that's what the horizon looks like. Based on 100 feet up, that's what the horizon looks like. Talk about quantum mechanics. So there was one of the scientists what's his name? And Arthur, forgot his last name, come to me. Arthur something. And he was asked by one of the skeptics, how do you come to these bizarre quantum mechanic conclusions, things that can't be measured? No one's ever seen a subatomic particle. No one's even seen an atom. You know, the image we learn in school that it looks like a cluster of grapes of neutrons, protons and electrons is just a convenient model for us to work with. No one knows that it looks like that. So they asked him, how can you come to these conclusions by things you've never seen, visible forces? So he gave the classic example of the name eludes me. I'm trying to remember. Okay, forget about the name. He gave the classic example of a fisherman that spread his net across all the seas and gathered up all types of fish and began documenting different shapes and sizes and species. And finally came to a major conclusion. You know what the conclusion was? A Chelem conclusion. And that was, there are no fish in the sea that are shorter than a half-inch long. That's his conclusion. Now, you and I, even we never did anything, we know there are fish that are smaller than a half-inch. But that's his conclusion, because that's what he measured. He was about to make this big announcement to the wizards of the world when his little daughter said to him, I know there are fish that are smaller. He says, well, there's not here. She said, let's look at the net. And they look at the net. The net has spaces between the ropes that are a half-inch wide and long. So obviously, every fish that was shorter than a half-inch long fell back into the water. So this great scientist, all he needed to add was, if you use a net that has half-inch spaces, you're never going to catch fish that are shorter than a half-inch long. But you don't need a scientist for that. That's simple. Everyone knows that. So his conclusion would have been correct, but then someone would have asked, what instrument did you use? So someone will say, you know what? I don't believe in love because I can't measure it. I know a guy, a very smart guy, comes around to the class once in a while, and he says to me, I don't believe anything I can't count, meaning money. I said, what about love? I'm not sure. What about intelligence? So yes, it depends what instruments you use. If you want to use your fingers to count, you're going to count things that that fingers can count. If you're going to use more subtle tools, you'll capture other experiences. You know, if you find connoisseurs of either wine or music for that matter, they're able to discern certain sounds that most of us won't pick up because they're listening with different ears. Just like animals can pick up sounds we humans don't pick up. Different decibels and so on. So to make a statement it doesn't exist because I can't see it or I don't have the instrument is incorrect. You have to say, based on the instruments that I have, I cannot see this and that and so on. That's the only qualification that's required. Many people just don't add that. They say, no, I know. But you know based on your farm. So the first step in any growth is bittul. Bittul is recognizing, suspending modestly and with humility recognizing, suspending your preconceived notions about something in order to be able to perhaps absorb something greater than you are. If you're incapable of that, in the fullest sense of the word, love will be compromised, relationships will be compromised, growth will be compromised, because nothing in life really is able to metamorphosize from one state to another if you don't go through such a shift. If we still go with the mentality that we had when we were 12 years old, where would we be? We have to go through life. You learn from your mistakes. You learn from trial and error. If a person doesn't want to learn from trial and error, they will be victim of their mistakes. What is someone who's growthful recognizes? Yes, I went through perhaps a setback, a loss, a vacuum, confusion. Creativity is a child of confusion. There's no creativity on earth. I can talk as a writer or as a speaker that is not preceded by some confusion and frustration. And the greater the innovation, the more confusion you're going to have beforehand. You ever try to research something, you want to write something up or you want to develop something? You're always going to first have a lot of data, then it's going to get a complete confusion. You won't know whether you're coming or going. And some of us give up, actually. But if you see it through, you come to suddenly something crystallizes. Because that's growth. So growth, in the words of the Kabbalists, would be yesh, ayin, yesh. What that means is we start with a state of being. You go through some vacuum or some vacuum is the other word I want to use, some form of void, and then you you reach a higher level. And if you don't have that empty cup void, you won't assume anything new. The basis of all stereotypes is based on preconceived notions without being open to hear something different. I mean, how often do we dismiss people because we think they belong to that group? And then you find out, one second, why would you like to be defined by a group? Maybe you're an exception. Maybe the group itself, there are different nuances and so on. But that's what it is. It's we see something and conveniently we dismiss it or we put it on a shelf. That belongs there. I deal with this all the time because I deal a lot with the secular world. And here I am with a yarmulke and a beard. I remember when I wrote Torah Meaning for Life, so I traveled across the country. The publisher sent me on a book tour. So I was everywhere. And I was on different media. I remember a Cleveland morning drive show on TV. And I was on the show. It came on for a few minutes, these morning shows. And I remember when I walked in, it was a live show. So the interviewer was a young woman. She was shocked when she saw me. And she actually said it on air. She says, I'm really shocked by seeing you. Why? Because I love your book. I never would have imagined that the author of this book looks like this. So that's what she said. I know she didn't mean it that way, but that's how it came out. So it was great little banter we had because I feigned indignation at her stereotyping me, which was my point. And I said, why would you say that? That would be like me saying, I'm shocked that you look the way you look, She said, because the book is so universal. It's so secular even. And you look like a religious, Orthodox, Haredi, whatever she put it. I don't think it's Haredi, she said. She used some other word. So I said, and then she said to me, wouldn't you be more received well if you looked like the rest of us? So I said, would you say that to someone who's a black? Wouldn't they be more received well if they changed their color? Or to someone who has some other orientation? Would you ever get away with that? With saying that, wouldn't you get a higher pay if you were a man, etc.? I said, no, part of growth is you looking at me and maybe challenging your stereotypes. Why would you stereotype me? Maybe you should look at my soul instead of my dress. And I meant it, and I didn't mean it in a way to offend. I just really wanted to make the point, because that's what we do. That is what we do. And bittul is, across the board, is the key to lowering the volume of your ego and yourself in order to allow something greater to experience. That's when we stand in awe, let's say, of a beautiful natural scene. What do you think awe is? Awe is that something has awed you. It's overwhelmed you. It's not about you. You're now absorbed in something greater. And whenever that happens, we always feel uplifted, which is interesting. Even as much as we worship our egos don't lift us up. We never feel empowered. You may feel very protective, very greedy, and so on. Awe is always an experience. A transcendent experience means, precisely as the word implies, you transcend yourself. You're now in the presence of something you realize is far greater than you are. And that's not minimizing your identity. It's not belittling, and it's not in any way humiliating or demoralizing. On the contrary, you feel you're part of something greater. I mention this even though I know not everyone in this room may have children, but those of us that have children know when the birth of a child, there's something about it that there's no one on earth that I haven't met every person, but enough to say everybody says the miracle of birth, no matter whether they're believers or not believers, because it's hard to fathom. Suddenly, look at all of us sitting right here in this room, or wherever we are online, that once upon a time you didn't exist. Simple as that. Then your father's seed fertilized your mother's ovary egg, and something happened. No one understands what happened. Something magical. Conception. One cell, minuscule. And that one cell multiplied. And then 9 months later, today we see the stages of development of the fetus, and 9 months later, a beautiful child, a little boy or girl, pops out to this world. And here we are 20, 30, 40 years later, whatever age all of you are. You all look young to me. And with all our complexities, this human being that you are sitting in your chair, or wherever you are, 5, 6 foot tall person, 100 pounds, 150 pounds, 180 pounds, we won't go higher than that. And with all the complexities, your neurosis, the therapy you go to, the agonizing, explain this. Can anyone explain something like that? We get used to it and we get distracted, but you cannot deny the miracle of a moment of birth. And anyone that's seen it, whether they physically see it or know their child was born, in that moment they are in awe of something greater, and it lifts you up. It's not like it belittles you. That's not a humiliating experience, not a demoralizing one. It's not like, oh, you're a nobody. On the contrary, you suddenly feel that you're part of something that is unfathomable. Simple as that. Something awesome. That is a pure experience of bittul. What's happened? It's not about you. Something greater has now allowed you to be part of it. And with that context, that's something which is it's a tool. So there are things in life that it happens to us. As I said, you go visit the 7 wonders, or, as I mentioned, the birth of a child. You can give hundreds. You can stare at a flower. You can let any part of nature. Look at your own body. Look at the miracle of breathing. Study it, and you'll see it's a miracle. The miracle of digestion, whatever it may be. When you study, you suddenly realize there's something bigger. And what it does is, it humbles you, but also lifts you up to another place. These are all bittul dika experiences. That's why it's a word that's unknown, but it's the secret to everything. Everything comes from it. What's even more fascinating, and this goes back to answering the question that I asked, that it's invisible. A yud is essentially an invisible letter. It's not invisible. Of course it's a dot, but as I mentioned before, it's only a dot because we have no other way to express it, just like the mathematical point. So the only way to do it is you make a point, but a point doesn't occupy space. And yet, it's the basis of everything. Without points, you have no lines, and without lines, you have no planes, and without planes, you don't have entities. The same thing with the yud. Everything requires a yud. You cannot begin to write any letter without a yud first. You have to make a dot. You have to start with one point. And then you can extend the point, a line, a circle, an oval, or whatever it may be. So everything begins with the yud, just like everything begins with that one cell, that one seed, that one kernel or nucleus, and that makes up everything. So here's the fascinating so-called formula. Nothing creates everything, in a way. But it's not nothing as in nothing as it does nothing exists. It's nothing as it's not defined by ego and defined by everything that we define power. It's the smallest letter, but it has the most power, most potency. So how do we explain that? That why are the most powerful forces in existence invisible? So let me explain it with an analogy. Or not really an analogy, just a common occurrence. If you have to describe, someone asks you to talk about, let's say, the weather, we can talk endlessly about the weather, right? It's actually a God-given gift to be able to create, to develop, to alleviate awkwardness, let's say when you're in an elevator. So someone like, I remember I was in an elevator, was going up to the 70th floor or something, and it was very full, packed elevator, everybody was quiet. So I said, well, no one's going to talk about the weather? And everybody burst out laughing, because the weather is a perfect non-significant topic to talk about. We're under the weather, we're over the weather, it's going to snow, it's going to rain, it rained yesterday, hey, it's getting cool, it's hot, Now, if you think about it, I mean, I'm not saying it's pretty innocuous, it's innocent conversation, but you can talk about it. As a matter of fact, the Weather Channel, the blessing of the Weather Channel, 24/7 weather. I remember when the Weather Channel was first founded, everybody wondered who's interested in watching weather 24 hours. You know, a weather report. But they want to hear that it's like the wind is going at 25 miles an hour to the southeast. How does that affect you unless you're going boating? But it gives you a sense of, I understand. Wow, the winds are going that way. Just a little humor to lighten things up. But the point I'm making here is it creates. And now we could talk about the weather. Now we could also talk about sports. You know, sometimes I take a long drive and I want to understand a little modern culture. Well, you got to do talk radio. Thank God, talk radio is endless. Once day, especially if you have a satellite radio, everything you want. Want to talk about football, and it doesn't have to even be in season. If it's out of the season of sports, you're talking about the trades, and the next deadline, and this, that. So there's plenty talk. And if you start wondering, what are we talking about? Nothing of life and death. Like if this conversation didn't happen, would it really make a difference? What's going on inside? Tell me, give me. With our inner feelings, even with someone you trust, it's hard to express deeper inner feelings. So here's the ironic question, the irony, the question. Why, when it comes to superficial things which don't really matter, you can talk forever? And when you talk things that really matter, you have very few words. That's going to answer the question why powerful things are invisible. So the Hasidic masters have a fascinating and simple way to explain it. They basically say great quality is always the antithesis to large quantity. Meaning, when you're speaking, words are containers. Containers have measure. Every container has measure. So a container can only give you as much as the container is capable of containing. So if you want to, let's say, get a gallon of water in a cup that's a quart, it won't happen because the cup is too small. So think of words as containers. Since they're limited containers, they can express limited ideas. More intimate feelings, more important feelings, are simply too large for that container, which is why we humans created the language of metaphor, poetry, music, art. With music, suddenly someone will say, I can't express it in words, but I can sing you a song. And suddenly song captures a sentiment that's very hard to articulate in words. Or poetry, sometimes even riddles, cryptic terms. Now, as children, most children have no idea, don't understand poetry. Frankly, most adults don't either, but they make believe they do. But poetry, you start wondering, why is the poet, why can't you just say the sentence the way it's supposed to be? Why do you have to make it so, weird? And the answer, of course, when you appreciate it, is because it's trying to convey a sentiment that can't be conveyed quite in regular conventional prose, the conventional sentence. So that play of words or the twist of words has just a way of expressing it that can't be expressed in regular language. So we've widened the containers with metaphor. They now allow more energy to flow. But then there are experiences that even metaphor doesn't help. And just as an example, a laugh, a sigh, a Jewish oy vey can capture more than volumes. Why? Because sometimes the feelings are so intense that even metaphor, any words are just too much for that feeling. So we'll say oy, or we'll laugh. Then there is a point where the feelings are so deep that even a sound is too much. I mean, usual example is not a positive one, but I'll use it just to make the point. Shock by trauma. Someone's traumatized, God forbid, and no one should ever know of this. There's a point you can't even cry. You'll always see when there's a traumatic event, whether it's a family killed in an accident or something, the close ones, and especially good therapists will know this, the first stages, they can't even cry. It's so utterly overwhelming, you can't even utter a cry. Then there comes a stage where you begin to be able to, and if it's a healthy process, the cathartic process of healing is that you have to help people cry. That's why very important in early intervention, especially for children, when there's trauma, that they should learn to express their feelings, because if it gets bottled up over the years, it's not healthy. So you see here's a state of utter shock, utter silence. And that silence is louder than all the words, but because it's so powerful, words and sound are just simply inadequate containers. So there you have it. The more powerful the energy, the less the containers. That's why the most powerful forces are invisible, because our eyes are limited containers. We only see superficial things. We cannot see the forces beneath the surface. So in the interesting, fascinating way, this bittul that I'm talking about is invisible. It doesn't, if you say, what does it look like? It looks like nothing. You know what looks big? Aggressive people, selfish people, narcissism. Someone saying, I want it all. A person that's humble, humility doesn't sound large, but humility is more powerful than aggression. And to use an example, when you see an intelligent person, let's say you're having a debate, a few people are having a conversation, an argument, a constructive argument, and you see there's a wise person sitting there, he's not commenting. But you know that he has what to say, he or she has what to say. So they're not commenting, should never be confused with meaning they have nothing to say. Often we think that way because we live in a world where we're told, if you're not going to go out and be a go-getter, you're not going to get it, you're not going to have it. But there's an expression, siyag lachachma shtika. The support, the gate to wisdom is silence. Silent people, wise people, you learn more from their silence than from their words. You learn more from when they don't react than when they do react. Because the smart person knows how to exercise restraint and discipline. But it's silent, you can't tell. Because we measure, again, things by, if someone didn't state an opinion, that means that they have nothing to say. You're just a wimp. It's not true. The greatest strength, what do you think? For a wise person, is it harder to speak or harder to be silent? Obviously it's harder to be silent because he has what to say. So to restrain himself from speaking, or for her to restrain herself from speaking, requires exerting more energy than speaking. So then suddenly everything is inverted. That the greatest things in life are the restraint that we exercise, the restraints that we exercise. And you can't see it, but nevertheless it's the most powerful force. Let's think of parents again and children. Where do you see the greatest contributions that parents give their children? I'm talking about healthy parents. The truth is, you don't see it. The things that get awards, where there's cameras and there's pictures and fireworks, are the things that everybody sees. You see children. Where are children shaped? When no one's around, when a mother is cradling a child and soothing a child, and there are no cameras and there are no awards. In the quiet little details is where life is shaped. We live in a world where, we like drama. We want everything pronounced. But the greatest events in life happen, and especially intimate events in life, happen in very quiet, private ways. Not because they don't have power, because of their power, subtlety is their greatest expression. So subtlety is not appreciated in a world that values aggression. But subtlety is the key to everything. You look at, as I said, someone playing the violin, ice skating. It's all about subtlety. And that subtlety wields more power than sheer firepower. And this is true across the board. When King Solomon was asked by God, ask one thing and I'll grant it to you, he didn't ask for wealth, he didn't ask for power, he didn't ask for conquest, he asked for wisdom. Because with wisdom you can get everything else. Now, bittul is the art of subtlety, is another way of expressing it. And that's the letter Yud. So he describes in this sixth chapter one example of it. In Hebrew, as I said, the Hebrew alphabet has many letters. The Yud plays prominent not just in the letter Yud, but also in other letters. One Yud can change something from life to death or from death to life. Here's an example. Everybody knows the most famous liturgy, Jewish Hebrew prayer. The Shema, right? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. And with a focus on the last word, Echad. What does Echad mean? God's divine unity. Some call it monotheism. It's really much more than monotheism. It means a unity that there's one reality, one divine reality, one inherent, integral unity that connects everything in existence. Echad. Now there's another word. In the second commandment of the 10 Commandments, you have another word. It says, Lo yeh lecha elekim acherim. You shall not have other gods. What is the word for other in Hebrew? Acher. Plural, acherim. Acher and echad sound awfully similar. And they are. The aleph is the same. The ches is the same. The dalet and the reish, which makes it echad or acher, look almost exactly the same. If you didn't know, if you had not tried die, you can not discern the difference. They both consist of two lines, like a roof, a line on top, and a line that goes down to the right. That would be like a, we don't have in the Hebrew alphabet, in the English alphabet. We have, I know in Latin there's a letter like that. It's like a right angle, but from the like this way, like that. So a reish and a dal look exactly alike, except one little difference, 1 point. There's a yud in the back of the reish that makes it into a dalet. You add a yud to the back of the reish, and that's a dalet. And what does that change? That's not just a change, okay, instead of ra, you say da. No, that's a change from life from death to life. Because acher means, if you said Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem acher, is saying I'm worshiping an idol. And echad means I'm worshiping one God. So there's a difference between oneness and plurality. So that's not a small matter. As the Medrash says, that little shift destroys worlds. Just the one. So you see in the subtlety of a dot how everything can change. And this is also a critical component in humility. As he explains, Reish and Daled both mean poverty. Rosh means impoverished, and Dalus is poverty. But there's two different types of poverty. One that comes from what's called low self-esteem, and one that comes from humility. What's the difference between low self-esteem and humility? Did you ever think about it? They can seem the same, they can look alike. You see two people who are being, let's say, basically both not expressing themselves, and one suffers from low self-esteem, the other one is being humble. So the masters explain, here's how they explain it. Low self-esteem means you think you're nobody, you're worthless, you're damaged goods, you're not valuable. And people step all over you and you allow it for whatever reason, whether you were abused or you just feel so self-loathing. An anav, that's a shuffle. An anav in Hebrew, humble, is the exact opposite. Moses is called the humblest man that ever walked on earth. He did not suffer from low self-esteem. He knew who he was. He knew God chose him. He knew what he accomplished. But here's where the humility comes in. It's coming from strength. The first one is an impoverished, broken spirit that has low self-esteem that's coming from weakness. Humility is a person saying, I have all these qualities, and I'm aware of them, and yet I know they were given to me from a higher place. And if someone else was given these gifts, they may have accomplished more than I have. That's the humble person. So a humble person is not someone that is distorting their own self-perception. A low self-esteem is distorting. It's someone who really feels they're worthless when they're not. A humble person has very clear self-awareness, but he never lets it get to his head to think I'm a self-made man or woman. I'm a channel for greater gifts. That is the epitome of real bittul. Now, often people confuse the two, and they think bittul means you're nobody. You know the joke, the rabbi is standing Yom Kippur, he's banging his chest, he's saying, I'm nobody, I'm nobody, I'm nobody. the gabbai, what do you call the gabbai? The sexton or whatever in the synagogue, he's also doing the same thing in another corner. He's banging his chest, no, I'm nobody, I'm nobody, I'm nobody. Then they suddenly, a simple Jew comes into services and he sees them both banging their chest. So he also starts banging his chest and says, I'm nobody, I'm nobody, I'm nobody. So the rabbi turns to the sexton and says, look who thinks he's nobody, you know? That is obviously not what we're addressing here. So there's an element of strength that you don't, it's not, again, one of these rare commodities in our day and age. Today, people are rewarded for their aggression, for stepping over others to climb the ladder, etc. But the greatest strength of all is the restraint shown by a person of power. That's why there's an expression in the Talmud that says, for one word, we'll give you a selah, a coin, a dollar, let's say. And for silence, we'll give you 2. Because it takes more effort for a wise person to exert restraint and not say what's on his or her mind than to say something. It takes more power, but it's not power that's visible. It's the patience that parents or educators show that is invisible. You know, if you were lucky and blessed, you may have had a mentor or a teacher like that years later you realize that the greatest thing they gave me was their restraint, that they didn't tell me the advice that I asked them to tell me because they believed that I could figure it out on my own. Those are the great teachers, the ones that tell you enough that for you to hear. Megala tefach, they reveal an inch, but they conceal 2. They tell you what you need to know, but they will never replace your decision making. They will allow you the dignity to learn how to solve your own problems. Now, they could have given you they could have told you that you did this wrong and that wrong and that wrong. You know, you have people, I'm sure everybody here has people that can tell you everything wrong you do. But the greatest people in your life are going to be not the people who tell you you're wrong. Not because they don't see it. They'll tell you the right words for you to come to recognize it on your own and you to solve it in a sustainable way on your own. That's the key. Because what's the point? Someone will tell you you did this wrong, so that solved the problem. So you may be humiliated, and then that's that. Didn't correct anything. The great teachers are the ones that will plant seeds that you will discover years later and say, wow, now I understand why he told me this or did not tell me. You know, sometimes you meet people like that, and years later you realize you had a conversation and you say, why didn't he tell me advice? Decide. We are given gifts in life, and our job is to recognize that these are gifts that we were given. You'll see anyone who succeeds. I talk as a writer. You talk about athletes. There's a thing called being in the zone. You heard the expression being in the zone. What is being in the zone? Being in the zone means you lose sense of self in the process. So in the beginning, you're focusing and say, okay, I'm going to sit down now, I'm going to write something. Or I'm going to play a tennis game. The experienced people, at some point, get into the zone where they stop sensing themselves, the distinction between subject and object. And when you ask them later, how were you able to do that? You'll say, because I did not think about myself. You'll see many athletes are told, you're focusing too much on your methods. Don't focus on your methods. Don't focus. Just do what you were trained to do. And at some point, you just do it, and you lose sight. As soon as you think about yourself, the magic is lost. You ever have like a time you've been up all night in a project or something really passionate, you're passionate about, and you lose time, you lose sight that you're hungry, and then suddenly you realize, hey, 1 second, it's just 5 o'clock in the morning. I didn't eat for 12 hours. The gift was the time when you weren't aware, because you were so in the zone. And just to give you an example, there's a lot of examples of this. What does health feel like? You ever think of health? To be healthy, what does it feel like to be healthy? If you could describe it, you probably need a doctor. Because as soon as you can describe a sensation, health should be invisible. What does it feel like, blood rushing through your arteries and veins? It shouldn't feel like anything. If you feel something, it's not a good sign. If your heart is pounding, or you feel a thud, or this or that, that's not good. Health is invisible. Means you're not even aware of it, and that's the most powerful part of it. If I asked you, for example, what is your left leg doing? So now you're thinking about it, so now you know it's doing something. What was the moment before I said, was it not there? It was there, but you just were not focusing on it. So the beauty of life is really coming to realize what we call being aware and consciousness. Everyone thinks is such a blessing. No, maybe not. Maybe consciousness and awareness, it means, is that you're too aware of your being. A person who's completely submerged and absorbed in an experience is not even aware that they're experiencing, because as soon as they're aware, that means they're somewhat outside of it. It's somewhere already a duality going on. Let's ask the question, for example, you put your hand in water, your hand gets wet. Obviously, because a dry hand gets wet. Now, how about fish? Do fish get wet? How about water? Does water get wet? And the answer is no, because water is a state of being. Water is wetness. Wetness doesn't get wet. So there's an expression in Isaiah the prophet. He says, the world will be filled with divine knowledge as the waters cover the sea. There's knowing and there's knowing. You could know something, but there's you, the knower, and there's the knowledge. And then there comes a point where you become one with the knowledge. And there's no way to distinguish. It's like experience. You know it so much in your gut, you no longer can distinguish between you and the knowledge. In the beginning, when you learn an idea, every idea takes time till you assimilate it, till you integrate it and absorb it. But once it becomes so much part of you and just resonates as a truth, you no longer have to say, 1 second, I have to understand it, because you're no longer there. You have now become one with it, and it's become one with you. So when you think about this, you start wondering in life, how many other experiences are there that are like on that external level? They say that, for example, the word love, is it a verb or a noun? Okay? So people make love and there's love. So some say for women, love is a noun, a state of being. And for men, it's a verb, it's an action. Now, when anything is a state of being, it's far more real than when it's an action. An action means while you're acting, it's love. And a moment later, it's not. But a state of being is all-consuming. That's who I am. There are people who are good people, and there are people who do good things. I remember once giving a class, I was speaking about the difference between doing good things and being a good person. So I was saying good things is while you're doing good things, you're doing something good. But it doesn't mean you're a good person, because it could be a moment later you're not that way. And a good person is 24/7 that way. Even when they're sleeping, they're good. And I gave some examples. For example, when a person is not convenient for you to be good. A good person will be good even when it's not convenient. And a person who does good things will do good things on their terms, when they want to do them. So I remember after the class, a middle-aged gentleman came over to me, maybe 50, 52. And he said to me, I have to tell you, I've come to many of your classes. Tonight, you answered a question I've been plagued by literally since I'm a child, for over 40 years. He told me he had a father. His father passed away already. His father was a big philanthropist and a very giving person, he said. I remember as a child, from the youngest of age, Monday night, anyone who came to our door was not turned away. Whether it was for money, a loan, a gift, get a job, a contact. My father would sit hours and hours and help anyone that came. And everyone came, whoever wanted could come, which was, a beautiful thing to see. On the other hand, my father had a lot of cruel side to him. He was not nice to my mother. He was nice to all of us, the children. And if you came Tuesday night, when he had his weekly poker game, nobody was let in. You couldn't even get through the front door. And as a child, you get confused. Is he a good person? Is he not a good person? And I learned tonight something. I said, my father was not necessarily a good person. He did great things, and I commend him for that, and I learned much from it. But he was good on his terms. Maybe his father also had the custom that Monday night, you're good. But Tuesday night, you're not. Or Tuesday night is my night. So that's the difference. And again, he said, I give my father credit because what he did, most people don't do what he did. But it was not what we can call a noun. It wasn't a state of being. It was not with a bittul. It was on his terms. And no, it helped him simply make clarity in his life and be able to distinguish of the things his father did that were great without confusing. That doesn't mean that in other things he did were not so great. So when it comes down to it, this letter Yud, which is, like I said, a letter of no letter, because it's a letter of no shape, really. It's a dot, it's true. But it really comes to signify the minimalistic amount of space that something occupies, like the mathematical point. It's there, but it's not there. And that becomes the bridge between our conscious reality and a higher unconscious or superconscious reality. It becomes the bridge between the permanent and the temporary, between the eternal and the temporal, between finite and the infinite, between the immortal and the mortal, and ultimately between existence and non-existence, and higher than existence. When you stand in front of a powerful, overwhelming, beautiful nature, you're experiencing something that exists and doesn't exist at the same time. What does that mean? It exists because it's there, but it's not on your terms, and based on your ego, based on your control, based on your power. You get absorbed in the experience. It's like someone gets submerged in water. There's that feeling where you're like, just like the fetus for 9 months is submerged in the embryonic fluids. That's the word, embryonic fluid. Amniotic. Yeah, but embryonic sounds good too, no? Poetic. That doesn't mean, I understand, it's not the... Are you a doctor too? Okay. But I stand correct, fine. And the Torah actually says that in the beginning of creation, the entire world was subsumed, was submerged within water, and then God split the water. There's a reason for that. You know, they say, why are human beings drawn to beachfront property? It's very expensive and all that. So people say because we evolved from amphibians, so we're drawn back to water. But from the Torah point of view, the mystical point of view, is because water reminds us of connection. When you're in water, you feel completely connected. You know, you ever go underwater and just you block out the whole world. It's like similar to when you put on a headset, you're completely submerged in music. It transports you to another time and place. And you're not thinking about yourself, you're part of something bigger. And you'll see whether any school of mysticism, Jewish, not Jewish, Far Eastern, all the poets and the romantics, and everyone talks about being completely submerged in the experience. Intimacy is not about you and the other. You become one flesh. You become at a point where you're not sensing yourself, and yet you're there in the biggest sense of self. So the interesting irony is that as soon as you begin to focus and recognize yourself, you lose it. It's when you don't sense it is when you experience the deepest element of it. And that's all captured in this one letter Yud and this word bittul. And there are many, many, many more examples I can give. I think I've given quite a few. But you'll find it throughout life, as I said, in growth, in relationships, in the ability to absorb. I always use the example, going back to what I did, was remembering hours and hours of talks. You know what the secret was? The key secret is that we have two parts of our brain. There's the part in our brain that is like a wheel called the absorber, and there's the processor. Children only absorb because they don't know how to process yet. Adults mostly process and lose the ability to absorb. So when we don't know how to listen well. While we're listening, we're processing. So when you hear someone speak, you think to yourself, I like the speaker, I don't like the speaker. I can make money with this, I can't make money with this. The I, you're already applying it to your life. Does it fit into your life? That's processing. Absorbing, there's no I. You're just absorbing someone else's words. Imagine how many arguments could be diffused if you're able to just listen to another and put yourself aside. Hillel, the sage Hillel, the Talmud says, was ultimately rewarded in his arguments with Shammai. They had many different arguments. So Hillel became the one that the ruling was of Hillel. And the Talmud gives a very interesting reason. Because he was the humbler one. How do we know? Because when he presented his arguments, he would always present Shammai's arguments first, and fully developed. He did not dismiss it, he would present it, and then he'd present his own argument. Most people do the opposite. You present your argument, and then as a footnote, you say, and by the way, there's someone else who said this and this, and you make it very, dismissive. So the question is asked, humility is a beautiful virtue. But what does it have to do with the ruling? Halachic legal ruling should be according to the more brilliant teacher, the one that has more grounded in sources, the one that makes a better argument. What is humility? Why humility? Give him an award for humility. And the answer given is a brilliant answer. Because the humbler the person, the more you can trust them. If someone's not humble, they may have great arguments, but how do you know that their biases and prejudices, and they want to be right, is not blinding them? Humility allows us to trust the person that is saying it, because they'll admit if they made a mistake. That they will not become consumed by pride or other forces that don't let them hear another opinion. So ultimately, even the truths of intelligence require humility, because humility knows that you can trust the person to being objective. And trust is just as important in intelligence as the intelligence itself. Because an arrogant person ultimately is going to make mistakes, and especially will cover up their own, because they won't accept, or they'll be blinded by their own prejudice to their own thoughts and ideas. So there you have the word. The word is bittul. It's a word you're not going to hear every day in the streets of Manhattan or other streets, but it's a word that lies at the heart of all of Jewish thinking and all of especially Hasidic thought. And bittul meaning not annihilation, not nullification, but the ability to suspend yourself to absorb something greater than yourself. Because at the end of the day, my friends, as great as you may be, everything is finite in this world. So greatness comes to an end. However, when you dedicate your life to a cause that is greater than you are, you'll dedicate your life to a cause that's eternal, then you become an extension of eternity. And that can never be achieved by a person on their own. That requires your being a channel for something that's greater than you are. And that's why you find that people who dedicate their lives or do things that serve others, that are giving, not taking. The guy that was once drowning in the sea, they tell the joke. So this guy John is drowning in the sea, and his friends see that, so they row out there to him, and they say, and one of them yells out, "John, give me your hand." And he refuses to give his hand. Again, "Give me your hand." No. So the other guy says, "John never gave anybody anything. Say, take my hand," and he'll take it. Say, "John, take my hand," and he drops his hand. There's some people just don't know how to give. They only know how to take. So he understood the word take, not the word give. But giving is the key to, allows you to become greater than you are. Taking, you'll accumulate more, you can hoard, you'll have a little more. But there's always a limit. To giving, there's no limit, because once you give, it's beyond you. It's beyond yourself. Sir Moses Montefiore, I should say, once was asked by Queen Victoria of England, "How much are you worth? What was his net worth?" So he came back with some number, and she said, "1 second. I personally know that you are worth a lot more than that. Why did you give me a number that seems a lot lower than your value?" He says, "I told you the true number. You asked me what I'm worth. You didn't ask me how much I have in my bank. Yes, I have all kinds of different investments. What I'm worth is the money that I've given away to charity, because that forever is mine. What I have right now, tomorrow can be lost in a bad investment. It can be lost to the weather. It could be lost at war. It could be confiscated. Anything can happen to it. So it's mine, in my possession, but I can't say I own it. What I've given away, the hospitals I've built, the charities I've given, the people I've helped, that's forever. Nobody can ever take that away." And he understood that secret. But we live in a world that is somewhat of a narcissistic, parasitic world, and we get consumed with the moment, and we get seduced and distracted by things that are temporary, and we worship them as if they're eternal. That is why the ultimate blessing and the ultimate gift is to recognize you have great skills, you have greatness, but your greatness is not yours. As soon as you recognize that, then you become a channel for something greater than you are, and that's the key to true eternity. So that's, in essence, part of the chapter 6 that I described. There's obviously more to it. There's the expression, ten l'chacham v'yech kameid. You give wise people wisdom, and they can take that wisdom and it'll spawn new wisdom. So I hope all of you can take this and do it as you see fit, if it resonated with you. And as I began this evening, I'll now conclude that it's a great honor to be part of your journey, to be part of the journey of so many unique souls. It's always been my great blessing to feel that I can some way be part of it. And in many ways, I've been giving this class for over 34 years. I could say that I probably grew from it more than the people that have been here. But I hope it goes both ways. It's reciprocal, because when you don't focus on the immediate, you focus on the vibe, the energy. There's an energy that flows from people, even if they're not speaking. So I may have done all the speaking this evening, but you may be surprised. I may have heard more than you've heard from you. Because it's whether it's the body language, the vibes, not everything is sounds. Some things come that are beyond sound. So God bless you all. We should all have a place where we can maybe meet, the two worlds meet. The world of sound and the world beyond sound. Like we should be able to express the inexpressible and to be able to integrate and internalize the transcendent. So everyone have a very blessed week. And this journey continues every Wednesday, both online and live. It's good to meet some people that I know have seen me. It's always interesting. People see me and I've not seen you, so that's I find there always a little imbalance there, but it's perfectly fine, great. And if you, anyway, Meaningful Life Center, myself can help you in your journey, please don't hesitate to be in touch. If you haven't left your email address, we have here a list, please do. We send out a weekly email, a weekly thought I write every week, different topics. And yes, thank you very much. It's been an honor.